All right, today we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment. So we're going to look at what this movement was. We're going to look at some key principles and ideas of this movement. We're going to run through a whole bunch of Enlightenment philosophers, or Enlightenment philosophers. We're going to look at their key principles and ideas, and then we're going to look at how the beliefs of these folks spread around Europe. All right, so first of all, what was the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment was a 17th/18th century intellectual movement that applied the principles of the scientific revolution in order to promote societal progress. So essentially what these philosophers did is they looked at different aspects of human society, like politics and economics, and they tried to look at them using the same tools and methods as scientists, so looking at them like scientists and applying those same principles to solve human problems. So what are the key concepts of this movement? So again, kind of like what I just said, there was an emphasis on the use of reason and scientific inquiry to solve political, economic, and social problems. And because, of course, they're applying all these tools to solve social problems, right, there was a really strong sense of optimism and a belief that progress could and should be achieved and that human lives could be made better through these scientific tools and methods. They also had a really strong belief in liberty and freedom and this thing called the social contract. And we'll look at what this idea is. And this idea actually evolved over the course of the Enlightenment. So we'll look at how it changed as well. And then Enlightenment philosophers also believed that humans are endowed with certain natural rights. So rights that belong to them and that no government, no person can take away. And they also believed that human society behaves according to natural laws, just like the natural world behaves according to natural laws, right? So again, kind of looking at how Newton, discovered that the natural world behaves according to certain principles, so too did the Enlightenment philosophers believe that human society behaved according to certain principles, right? And then a final belief that a lot of Enlightenment philosophers shared was an idea called deism. And this is a belief that God made the world according to these natural laws, but that God doesn't really interfere too much with human affairs. So what this is really a continuation of that increasing trend towards secularism that we saw all the way back in the Renaissance. So that's going to come back as well. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to run through a bunch of these different Enlightenment philosophers, and we're going to look at what their key beliefs and ideas were, and try and notice sort of the trends. These Enlightenment philosophers are all reading each other and building off of each other's ideas, so see how these ideas sort of change and evolve as we go through. So our first Enlightenment philosopher is an English guy named Thomas Hobbes, and the key book that he wrote is a book called Leviathan, which was published in 1651. So really notice the date and historical context there. So he's writing this book during the English Civil War, right? So he's seeing all this chaos, all this violence, and that's really going to shape his understanding of human nature and his understanding of government. So he believed that in what he called the state of nature, which is a moment in history in which there is no government, right? Human beings would constantly be at war with one another, and that life would be, in his words, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And this is because he saw human nature as kind of inherently violent, inherently greedy. If there's no external structure to restrain us, we're just going to be fighting constantly, in his view at least. And he believed that the solution to this problem, the best form of government, was actually an absolute monarchy. So he believed that human beings should make this social contract with this monarch and give up all of their freedom to the government in exchange for protection. You're like, hold up, you just told me that Enlightenment philosophers were all about liberty and freedom. Hobbes doesn't seem to be all about that. Well, that's going to change. So people are going to take Hobbes' idea of the social contract, and they're going to change that and tweak that a little bit and make it more, sort of emphasize the freedom in that relationship, right? Because there is some freedom there. People are making the active choice to give up some of their freedom to the government. All right. And so the person who's really going to run with that idea of the social contract is another Enlightenment philosopher who comes a little bit after Hobbes, and his name is John Locke, and he's also English. And he was really interested in all kinds of topics. So he was interested in government, but he was also interested in sort of education and human development. So unlike Hobbes, he believed that people aren't naturally evil. Instead, he believed that people are born as a blank slate. or in Latin, a tabula rasa. And he believed that people learn through experience, and again, they're not really born with any innate knowledge or any innate sense of morality or anything like that. Everything they kind of learn as children. So this led him to believe that education was really, really important, because he wanted to educate people to learn how to be good citizens, right? And he was also a really strong proponent of religious toleration, like a lot of our Enlightenment philosophers will be. And again, as I mentioned, right, government was a real subject of interest for him. So the key book that he wrote here was a book called Two Treatises of Government. And look at the date on that one too. So he's actually writing later than Hobbes. So he publishes his book in 1690, by which point the Glorious Revolution has already happened, right? So he's seen constitutional monarchy actually work. So again, this is going to shape his view of government too. So what he believed is that human beings have the natural right to life, liberty, and property. And if that sounds really similar to something in American government that you learn in 8th grade, yes, he did influence our founding fathers. And Locke believed, he wasn't actually a big proponent of constitutional monarchy. He went a little bit further, and he believed that the best form of government is a republic. So people vote for the people who represent them and make laws for them. And like Hobbes, he believed in this idea of the social contract, but he saw it in a little bit of a different way. So he believed that people should surrender some of their freedom to the government in exchange for protection, but he doesn't think that people should surrender all of their freedom to an absolute monarch. So he believed also too that there's an obligation on the part of the government here as well. So if the government doesn't protect people's natural rights to life, liberty, and property, people have the right to overthrow it. And if again that rings a bell, a lot of our Declaration of Independence in the United States, that's based on Locke's philosophy. So those ideas should probably sound pretty familiar to you. All right. Another Enlightenment philosopher, we're going to switch over to Germany now, and he's a little bit less interested in government, but he's also interested in sort of human behavior and morality, right? Immanuel Kant is the name of our philosopher, and he was actually one of the first to kind of conceptualize the Enlightenment as like this new special movement. And he was actually kind of similar to Descartes, who we talked about last time, and that he was really interested in how people could use reason rather than observation to kind of understand the world. And this is this idea of transcendentalism. And again, as I mentioned too, he's not really as interested in government as Locke and Hobbes, but he is interested in sort of morality and ethical behavior. And he had this idea called the categorical imperative, which is this idea that, again, it's sort of a natural law. So it's a universal principle we can apply to every situation. And this is the idea that you should act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time will that it should become universal law. Wait, what? Basically, this is the golden rule. So in other words, if everyone did what you were doing, would it lead to irrational or negative consequences? Then it's bad. You shouldn't do it, right? So I kind of think of it this way, like, so you are driving down the freeway, right? And you're driving maybe way faster than the speed limit or breaking other traffic laws, right? Well, what if everybody else did that? Wouldn't that lead to problems? Yes, it would. So Kant would say it's bad. All right. Next up, we're going to go over to France with the Baron de Montesquieu. So Baron is his title. I'm actually not sure what his name is. And his key text is a book called On the Spirit of Laws. And you're going to see some echoes in American government here as well. He's also one of the Enlightenment philosophers who influenced our founding fathers. So he observed and classified forms of government in social classes and believed that governments behave according to natural laws. So again, looking at government like a scientist. And he believed that the best way to ensure liberty, he didn't really make a statement on republic or monarchy or anything like that, but he did believe that the best way to ensure freedom and liberty was a government based on separation of powers. So he believed the government should be separated into three branches: executive, who carries out the law; legislative, who makes the law; and judicial, who interprets the law. Oh, gee, do we have that in the United States? Yes, we do. And he also believed in another idea that we have in the United States that we borrowed from him, which is the idea of checks and balances. He believed that each of those three branches of government should have the ability to check the power of the other branch. So the point is that government works within itself to limit its own power to ensure that no one part of government becomes too powerful and oppresses people and limits their freedoms. All right. Following from that, another French philosopher, we've got Denis Diderot. And Diderot is not really so much famous in and of himself, but he's famous for publishing this book called the Encyclopedia. I think that's how you pronounce it. And that's where he basically compiled a bunch of other different philosophers' ideas on how to improve society. He put them all together. And what he did is he published this book pretty cheaply. So that allowed these Enlightenment ideas to start to spread around Europe. Another interesting thing about Diderot is, again, he's also one of our Enlightenment philosophers who advocated for religious toleration. And he was really critical of Christianity, especially Catholicism. But again, think about it this way. He's French, right? So he's living in a country where the Catholic Church is still pretty dominant compared to philosophers like Locke and Hobbes, right? Who are living in a country where there's the Anglican Church, but it's not quite as powerful. All right. Another French philosopher who's really, really famous for his critique of organized religion is Voltaire. And that's actually, I believe, a pen name. And so he was a deist, right? So he is religious, right? He does believe there is a God, but he was really, really critical of the corruption of the Catholic Church in France, especially. And he was a really strong supporter of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. He really fought against censorship. And he was actually kicked out of France for holding these beliefs. You can see he's really trying to speak his truth to power here. So he ends up traveling all over Europe, and he actually ends up in Prussia. And we'll talk a little bit about the ruler in Prussia who supports him during the next lecture. And Voltaire is interesting in that he wasn't a monarchist, but unlike a lot of the other Enlightenment philosophers, he wasn't really a Republican. He didn't really support democracy. He thought that people were kind of dumb, and he wasn't super faithful that, or he didn't really believe that people had sort of the ability to govern themselves, right? So he's actually going to become a proponent of this thing called sort of enlightened absolutism. We'll talk about that next lecture. And the book that's associated with him is a book called Candide, which is a satire. So it's sort of a critique, a humorous critique of society around him. And he was a little bit more pessimistic than other Enlightenment philosophers. So he's kind of critiquing other Enlightenment philosophers' faith that they could change the world through reason and science and understanding. And he's a little more cynical than our other Enlightenment philosophers. He's also really funny, too, if you ever read him. All right. And then we're going to come to my favorite Enlightenment philosopher because he was pretty quirky. And this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, so another French philosopher. And he's often grouped with Hobbes and Locke because he's really interested in human nature and government, but he had a really different take. So Hobbes, right, super negative view of human nature. Locke believes that humans are a blank slate. Rousseau believes that human beings are naturally kind and virtuous, and they share. And he based this belief on basically reading about people in the New World. So weirdly enough, going all the way back to our first unit, we talked about Bartolomé de las Casas and how he portrayed the Native Americans as like super kind and innocent. Well, Rousseau read that, and he's like, yeah, when there's no government, people must be really nice. Even though they did have government in the New World before the Europeans got there. So his take is not super historically or sociologically accurate, but it is pretty interesting. And you're like, okay, well, what happened? How did people become less nice? Because Rousseau doesn't think people are super nice and innocent now. Well, what happened? Well, he actually thinks that human beings became corrupted by society, and he's especially worried about the development of private property. So there's this whole thing about how when people first put up fences and they enclosed the land and said, this is mine, that made human beings bad because human beings all of a sudden started fighting over who had this and who had that and who had more than other people and so on and so on and so on. So he's kind of a critique of he's a critic of capitalism too, excuse me. And Rousseau is also interesting because he is not as big a fan of reason as a lot of other Enlightenment philosophers are. He also believes emotion is really important. So he's kind of bridged the gap between the Enlightenment and another intellectual movement, which we're going to talk about a bit later, which is called Romanticism. Rousseau is also, and again, as I mentioned, he's interested in government. And he believed that the best form of government is a government by the general will. So again, we like to compare him to Hobbes and Locke. So we've got Hobbes on the far end who likes absolute monarchy. We've got Locke who's kind of in the middle who likes representative democracy or sort of a republican government. And then we've got Rousseau who likes direct democracy. So we have this idea that virtuous, enlightened citizens should come together to discuss and make their own laws. And again, he's also kind of varying this idea of a social contract. So people are coming together and making some sort of agreement. But in this version, people are governing themselves. They're not giving up power to somebody else. Rousseau is also really interested in education because, again, he's got sort of this continuing narrative here that people are bad or they're good at the beginning, then they get corrupted, but it's possible to make them good again. How are we going to do that? We need to educate people. And Rousseau is interesting because he had a bunch of kids, but he abandoned them all, but he had really strong opinions on like parenting and education. And he laid these all out in this book called Emile. And he had this idea that we need to sort of bring up men, not women, to become virtuous citizens. And he didn't really have a lot of faith in doing this for women. He thought women were not capable of reason or self-governance. So only boys. Sorry about that. And actually, there is another philosopher who responds to Rousseau's take on this, right? And she's a woman. Her name is Mary Wollstonecraft, and she's actually the mom of Mary Shelley. So if you're reading Frankenstein in English, she is the author of that book's mom. And she's really best known for this book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is really a response to Rousseau's view of women. And she's like, okay, hold on, Rousseau. Maybe women seem to be less capable of reason than men, but that's only because they haven't been given the opportunities to develop their capacity for reason. So she's like, if you educate girls the same way you educate boys, they're going to be just as capable of reason and understanding and being good citizens, etc. But what's interesting is she doesn't really argue that women should participate in politics in the same way. She argues this on this, or based on this perspective, that she believes that like if you educate women to be good citizens, then they'll raise their sons to be good citizens. So she's not like a feminist in the way we think of them today, right? So she's not really where we are now. Mary Wollstonecraft was also a really big advocate of democracy and sort of a republican form of government, so people are able to elect their leaders. And she wrote about this in a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Men. So you'll notice actually that actually was published before A Vindication of the Rights of Women, so she's kind of playing on the same title there. All right. So we talked a lot about sort of morality and government and society, but there's also a bunch of Enlightenment philosophers who are really interested in economics. So how economies function, right? And the most important of these is Adam Smith, and he wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations. And he was really critical of mercantilism and the idea that the government should be involved in the economy at all. And he was a proponent, or he argued in favor of, this idea called laissez-faire economics. And this was the idea that economies work best when prices are set by interaction between consumers and suppliers without government intervention. So we've heard of like, oh, the laws of supply and demand. That's Adam Smith. So he does not like the government being involved in the economy at all. And you have this idea that basically if the government is involved in the economy, its role should be to sort of protect private property and free exchange. It shouldn't be to control it or put up things like tariffs or anything like that. He also believed that humans are naturally motivated by self-interest, but this doesn't make them bad. If you allow self-interest to play out, it'll actually, the free market will channel self-interest so that it benefits everybody else, right? So if I'm, selling donuts or whatever because it's in my self-interest to make money, well, that's going to benefit other people, right? Because then they get donuts. That's a terrible example, but that's kind of what he's getting at here. There were other Enlightenment philosophers who were interested in economics, and they called the physiocrats. The name you have to know there is Quesnay, and they also argued against mercantilism, and they were really critical of this idea that governments should accumulate ever-increasing amounts of gold and silver, and they were like, no, you gain wealth by encouraging production, essentially. So again, kind of going back to that idea, we like free markets and stuff like that, and we should encourage competition. All right. So those are Enlightenment philosophers. How did their ideas spread? We already mentioned this a little bit, right? We've got Diderot publishing the dictionary, which is pretty inexpensive, so folks could read it, right? But still, the Enlightenment was pretty limited, actually, to the aristocracy and the upper middle class. So, poor people, not necessarily always literate, and not necessarily sort of always interested in these big grand ideas, right? They were working, they weren't sitting around talking about ideas. There are rising literacy rates in Europe, though, and increasing public education. So we do see more and more people gaining access to these ideas. But again, it's not quite universal. Your average French peasant's probably not going to be reading these books. So there's that. And then ideas are often also spread through discussion in public gathering spaces. So there's I'm going to say it the English way, salons, not like a hair salon, like a salon. And these are basically like discussion groups, and they were often led by women. So basically people would get together in women's living rooms and just like chat about philosophy, which honestly sounds fun to me. I don't know, your mileage may vary. People are also discussing these ideas in coffee houses and cafes and reading clubs and libraries and scientific and philosophical societies and Masonic lodges as well.